Beneath the velvet skies of the American South, a grand celebration once unfolded. A wedding meant to mark joy, wealth, and continuity. Lanterns glowed against the heavy summer air, illuminating tables draped with linen, dishes piled high with roasted meats, candied fruits, and sugared cakes that glittered like jewels in the candlelight. Music filled the air, mingling with the hum of conversation and the laughter of guests dressed in their finest silks. It was a night meant for beauty and harmony, yet behind the carefully prepared feast lingered an invisible shadow. Hours later, the joyous melodies were replaced by shrieks of horror, bodies collapsing, faces contorted in agony. The same meal that had symbolized love and union had become a weapon of death. Whispers spread quickly, naming the source of the tragedy, the cook-slave who had prepared every dish. Some claimed it was vengeance, a carefully plotted act of rebellion. Others whispered of something far more uncanny, an ancient ritual woven into the food, herbs chosen not merely for their bitterness, but for their supposed ties to curses. In a world where science and superstition clashed daily, no explanation seemed fully sufficient. The timing was too precise to ignore. The wedding symbolized the transfer of wealth, power, and legacy from one generation to the next. Yet that very night, death consumed the bloodline meant to be celebrated. To some it was divine justice. To others, it was the cruelty of a desperate woman stripped of dignity and freedom. Records from the time remain scarce, yet scattered testimonies speak of unusual ingredients, of strange hymns murmured in the kitchen, of a cook whose eyes betrayed no fear as she stirred the pots. The story stands at the uneasy intersection of history and myth. Was she a murderer consumed by rage, or a victim forced into choices no human should endure? Was the family's demise simply the result of poison, or the manifestation of a curse carried across oceans, preserved in whispered recipes and ancestral memory? What truly happened that night remains unresolved, but its echoes linger still. Some believe she acted as a symbol of rebellion, her act a final cry against bondage. Others insist something darker stirred within the food itself, that the feast was less an act of revenge and more an invocation. The truth may be buried with the dead, but the questions refuse to fade. In that moment of celebration turned nightmare, innocence and evil sat side by side at the same table. And as history struggles to separate fact from folklore, one chilling possibility remains. Perhaps it was not only a family that perished that night, but the very boundary between the natural and the supernatural itself. Under the burning sun of the southern fields, where voices of the enslaved mixed with the endless rhythm of work, a child was born who would one day be remembered not for the sweetness of her bread, but for the bitterness of her vengeance. She came into the world nameless in the eyes of the law, property rather than person, recorded not as a daughter but as a number in a ledger. Her earliest memories were not of toys or play, but of the clanging of iron pots in the plantation kitchen, the hiss of fat in a pan, the sharp voice of the mistress demanding perfection in every dish. For her, survival meant learning quickly, measuring flour not with innocence but with fear, stirring pots not for pleasure but to avoid punishment. The kitchen became her school, her prison, and ultimately her weapon. She was taught to bake bread before she was 10, her small hands kneading dough until they blistered. Food was the language of her life, yet it was never truly hers. Each loaf she baked fed those who owned her, while she herself often ate scraps left behind. And yet, in these humble acts of labor, seeds of rebellion quietly grew. In the folds of dough and the simmer of broth, she carried not only the recipes of her captors, but also the whispered knowledge of her ancestors. Herbs known for healing, roots feared for their poison. From her mother she learned which leaves soothed fevers, which powders silenced pain, and which berries, if ground finely enough, could bring even a strong man to his knees. To understand her path, one must first understand the world that shaped her. The plantation was both stage and prison, where cruelty disguised itself as order. Christianity was preached from pulpits, commanding obedience, forgiveness, and silence. Servants, obey your masters, the verses rang out each Sunday, echoing through wooden chapels where enslaved men and women sat in silence, their eyes cast down. Yet beneath that silence simmered another faith, carried secretly from Africa to the Americas. A faith of drums and chants, of roots and rivers, of ancestors who promised justice when earthly laws failed. In her, these two worlds collided, one telling her she was born to serve, the other whispering she was not forgotten, that balance would one day be restored. The psychological burden of such contradictions cannot be underestimated. As a girl, she baked sweet rolls, their scent filling the halls with warmth, Yet she watched as those same halls echoed with the cries of the whipped. Innocence and brutality coexisted in every corner of her world. Each day, she saw the overseer's cruelty, the mistress's disdain, the casual cruelty of guests who praised her cooking but never looked into her eyes. What happens to a mind when every act of kindness it offers is consumed by those who deny its humanity? When bread meant to sustain life instead sustains oppression? Historians write of many who resisted in silence. Some fled into swamps, their names vanishing into legend. Others fought with fire and steel. But within kitchens, resistance often took another form. Poison. Across the South, rumors of tainted stews and bitter cups spread like wildfire. Plantation owners feared the silent revolt hidden in their meals, for the cook was the unseen keeper of life and death. Whether through arsenic stolen from rat poison, or through knowledge of deadly plants growing just beyond the fields, enslaved cooks were uniquely positioned to strike where it hurt most. At the table, the very heart of family and tradition. And so, fact and folklore became entwined. In local papers, whispers of poisonings were sometimes recorded, though always downplayed, dismissed as accidents or sickness. But within the quarters, the stories lived louder. Of a master who wasted away after a bitter stew, of children who fell ill after cakes dusted with powders no one could identify. Were these tales exaggerations, or were they fragments of a truth too dangerous to be written openly? To the enslaved, they were reminders that even in chains, power could shift in the quietest of ways. For the cook at the center of our story, these whispers were not abstractions. She carried them like hidden scripture, lessons folded into her being. She learned patience, the same patience required to let bread rise, to let meat stew until tender. She learned silence, for secrets spoken aloud could mean death. And above all, she learned that food, the symbol of hospitality, could be transformed into the most intimate form of rebellion. Yet rebellion does not grow from nothing. It grows from wounds layered over time. The child who once smiled at sugared cakes became the woman who stirred pots with eyes shadowed by loss. Each humiliation carved her deeper. The sale of a sibling, the strike of a whip, the denial of her own freedom even as the family she served celebrated their daughter's new life. The wedding was not merely a celebration. It was a reminder of all she had been denied. Love, choice, dignity, all stripped away and placed in the hands of others. In that moment, the contrasts of her life crystallized. Their joy built on her sorrow, their wealth built on her bondage. Psychology frames her choices as the product of trauma, a breaking point after years of suppressed rage. Was she born to kill, or did the system forge her into a weapon? Moral philosophy debates. Was her act murder, or was it justice? Religion, too, offered its interpretations. To the enslavers, she was the devil's servant, a woman who let Satan guide her hand. To her people, she may have been something else entirely, a vessel of ancestral justice, one who used forbidden knowledge to balance scales long tilted against her. Her life was a battleground of opposites, sweetness and bitterness, innocence and violence, prayer and curse. To see her only as a villain is to erase the world that created her. To see her only as a victim is to deny her agency, the choice she ultimately made. The truth lies in the haunting intersection of both. As the years in the kitchen passed, so too did her patience wear thin. Every wedding cake she frosted, every feast she prepared for others, became another reminder of the joys stolen from her. By the time the master's daughter was to be wed, the cook had reached the edge of endurance. Her decision was not sudden. It was simmered, like broth over low flame, until the moment arrived when it could no longer be contained. The wedding was not just their celebration, it was her reckoning. And so, when guests gathered, when laughter filled the halls, when the clinking of glasses echoed beneath chandeliers, a different rhythm pulsed in the kitchen. The same hands that once baked bread for love now measured powders for death. The act was not simply one of rebellion, but of transformation. Food, once the symbol of nourishment, had become her final language, her last declaration of a life lived in chains. She did not speak that night, at least not in words, but in the dishes she sent forth, she told a story the family would never forget, a story written not on parchment but in agony, not preserved in books, but in whispers that still haunt the South. The roots of bondage were also the roots of vengeance, and from the soil of suffering, she had cultivated the deadliest harvest of all. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia and candle wax, a night scripted for elegance and joy. It was the wedding of the planter's daughter, an event whispered about for months in the surrounding towns, for no expense was spared to make it the grandest affair the region had ever seen. Guests arrived in carriages polished until they gleamed under torchlight, their voices carrying through the humid night as musicians tuned their instruments. The bride wore lace imported from France, her gown a cascade of white silk, her veil pinned with pearls. Beside her, the groom smiled nervously, the promise of legacy and prosperity radiating through every gesture. For the assembled community, this union was more than marriage. It was spectacle, power, the living display of wealth. Yet beneath the polished veneer, a different narrative simmered. In the kitchen, away from the music and laughter, another performance was being prepared. One that would rewrite the meaning of that night forever. The cook moved like a shadow, her face calm, her hands steady as she lifted heavy pots and sprinkled seasonings with practiced precision. To the unknowing eye, she was fulfilling her expected duty, feeding the joyous multitude. But in the silence of her mind, she was writing her own scripture. Each spoonful was measured not only with spice, but with something far more deliberate. Powders, tinctures, and herbs slipped into the dishes, mingling with butter and cream, indistinguishable to taste but fatal in their design. The irony was brutal. Food, the symbol of comfort and unity, had become her tool of vengeance. She stirred the soup with the same motions she had practiced since childhood, yet each circle of the ladle was weighted with defiance. The hall where the feast would be laid was glowing with light. Chandeliers swayed gently, their crystals catching every flicker of flame. Tables groaned under platters of roasted duck, glazed hams, candied fruits, and golden loaves of bread. Silverware polished to mirrors reflected the faces of the guests, flushed with wine and cheer. There was an innocence to their laughter, a blindness to the shadow that trailed them. To them, the feast was simply abundance. To her, it was reckoning plated on porcelain. The bride's family, adorned in silk and jewels, raised their glasses in toasts. They spoke of love, of the bright future of the couple, of the eternal bonds of family. But the eternal bonds they praised would soon be severed in the most gruesome of ways. The moment of first indulgence carried the sharp edge of suspense. Guests praised the richness of the soup, the tenderness of the meat, the sweetness of the cakes. "She has outdone herself," some whispered, their compliments meant for the cook who remained invisible in the kitchen. But each compliment was laced with irony, for the flavors they adored masked a design they could not perceive. Mouths laughed, glasses clinked, forks scraped against fine china. Music swelled, dancers twirled, and beneath it all an invisible countdown had begun. It is here that psychology and religion collide most vividly. To some, her act was deliberate justice, carefully measured after years of degradation. They see her as a strategist, patient and composed, a woman who understood that the surest blow is the one no one sees coming. To others, especially those who lived to tell the tale, it was possession. They spoke of her eyes that night, how they gleamed like coals, how she hummed songs beneath her breath that were not hymns of the church, but chants of an older, darker origin. Was she an avenger guided by reason, or a vessel for forces that fed on suffering and blood? Accounts of what followed diverge, but all share a common thread: the moment joy twisted into horror. Some claim the first sign was the bride herself, her hand trembling as she lifted her goblet, her lips twitching as if a bitter taste had touched her tongue. Others say it began with the groom's father, who collapsed suddenly in his chair, his wine spilling crimson across the tablecloth like blood foreshadowing the carnage to come. Still others remember it as chaos erupting all at once, screams cutting through music, forks clattering to the floor, bodies convulsing in grotesque rhythm. One guest swore he saw a shadow pass through the hall, a dark blur that moved with no human form, vanishing just as the cries reached their height. The descriptions of the agony are as chilling as they are vivid. Faces turned pale, lips foamed, limbs thrashed against the floorboards. The hall that moments earlier had echoed with laughter now shook with the sound of retching and groaning. Musicians dropped their instruments, servants ran for help, and the bride collapsed in her white gown, the lace now stained with vomit and blood. The contrast was brutal, a vision of purity drowned in horror. The joy of a marriage replaced by the silence of death. In the kitchen, no one could say what she did in those moments. Some claimed she stood still, watching with expressionless calm, her hands folded as though in prayer. Others said she whispered to herself, a string of words no one could decipher, her lips moving in rhythm with the gasps and groans from the hall. A few servants, trembling with fear, swore they heard her laugh softly, a sound not of triumph, but of something otherworldly, as if another voice had joined hers. The poison acted quickly but not uniformly. Some guests lingered, writhing in pain for hours. Others fell instantly, their bodies lifeless before their heads hit the table. The variation only deepened the mystery. Was it simple poison, Or had the dishes been designed with cruel precision, certain plates carrying stronger doses than others? To this day, no one can say. The science of toxins was primitive, and doctors called to the scene could not agree. Some spoke of arsenic, a common substance in that era, easily obtained and deadly even in small amounts. Others insisted it was something more obscure, a mixture of herbs known only to those who still carried the traditions of the old world. Theories blossomed like weeds, none conclusive, all terrifying. But beyond science lay religion, which seized the imagination of the survivors. Priests declared it the work of the devil, a night in which Satan himself had walked the hall disguised in the body of a woman. They claimed the cook had sold her soul long before, that her knowledge of roots and powders was nothing less than witchcraft. Families who buried their dead told stories of curses, of food that carried not just poison but damnation. Children grew up hearing warnings not to trust the sweetness of a feast, lest the cook's spirit return to finish her work. Yet among the enslaved, the tale carried a different meaning. To them she was not a witch but a martyr. She had struck back at those who believed themselves untouchable, using the very tools of her bondage. Bread, meat, and wine, symbols of wealth and celebration, had been turned against their masters. Some whispered her name with reverence, others with fear, but all knew she had done what few dared. She had transformed survival into rebellion, silence into a weapon. The aftermath of the feast left the plantation in ruins. Bodies filled the rooms once reserved for celebration. Survivors wandered in shock, their fine clothes soiled, their faces hollow with disbelief. Servants fled into the night, some never to return. The bride and groom's union, meant to be remembered for joy, was instead immortalized as tragedy. And the cook? Accounts diverged sharply. Some say she was seized immediately, dragged from the kitchen and beaten until unrecognizable. Others claim she slipped into the swamps, vanishing like mist, leaving only the echo of her presence behind. But what cannot be disputed is the power of that night. The wedding feast became legend, a story repeated in hushed voices, each retelling shifting between fact and folklore. To some, it was evidence of human cruelty, proof that rage can twist nourishment into destruction. To others, it was divine retribution, a curse that unfolded precisely when joy was at its peak. What was meant to symbolize continuity of power instead dissolved into the ashes of a family line. Even now, historians argue whether the event was real or embellished. Yet the details, convulsing bodies, shadowed whispers, food transformed into death, remain stubbornly vivid. Perhaps it is the very ambiguity that keeps the story alive. The line between justice and evil, between possession and calculation, is too blurred to resolve. What happened at that feast was not just the collapse of a family, but the collapse of certainty itself. As the torches dimmed that night, as silence replaced chaos, a single question lingered in the ruined hall. Had they been poisoned by a woman's hand? Or by something far older and darker moving through her? And from that silence, debate has never ceased. The bodies had barely cooled before the questions began. What had happened inside that grand plantation hall on a night meant for celebration? Some guests had risen from their chairs in laughter, only to collapse mid-toast. Others staggered to the floor, gasping for air, eyes bulging, mouths foaming with a strange froth. Doctors were summoned, priests were called, and whispers spread faster than fire. Was this simply poison, the work of a calculating hand? Or had something older, darker, and far less explainable been at play? Physicians of the mid-1800s prided themselves on rationality, yet their tools were primitive compared to modern science. When they examined the dead and dying, their theories fractured. Some claimed arsenic was to blame, a powder easily hidden in sugar or flour. Others suggested ground glass, sharp and invisible, tearing at the intestines until nothing could save the victim. Still others spoke of toxic herbs, roots known only to those who carried the memories of Africa. Herbs that nourished when handled with care, but killed when used with intent. The cook's hands, after all, had known both recipes and remedies. She had grown up in the kitchen, where food, medicine, and magic were often indistinguishable. Survivors who lived long enough to recount the night described sensations unlike any ordinary illness. One woman said her skin burned as if fire licked at her veins. A young man claimed he heard singing, faint and distant as though voices hovered above the feast. Another swore that before the collapse a shadow passed through the hall, dimming the candles though no wind stirred. These testimonies blurred the line between science and superstition, between the tangible and the spectral. The coroner's notes, fragmented, barely preserved, referenced stomach linings inflamed beyond recognition. The tissue appeared blackened as if scorched. Yet arsenic, the most common poison of the day, often left no such trace. Was it another compound? Physicians debated in hushed tones, unwilling to declare certainty. To accuse a cook-slave outright required evidence, but the evidence dissolved as quickly as the food itself. What remained were bodies, screams, and rumors. The enslaved community on the plantation carried their own explanations. In whispered tones by the fire, they spoke not of arsenic or glass, but of roots, powders, and chants. Food had always been more than sustenance. It was a vessel for memory and a channel for resistance. Herbs carried across the ocean in braids of hair, or tucked into cloth bundles, were not merely spices. They were instruments of healing, of protection, and, when necessary, of vengeance. A stew could comfort, but it could also silence. A cake could celebrate, but it could also condemn. Christian preachers thundered that obedience was divine, that rebellion was sin. Yet African traditions reminded the enslaved that spirits listened, that justice could be summoned when earthly courts denied it. To the enslaved, the cook may have been more than a criminal. She may have been a priestess, an unwitting bridge between suffering and retribution. Each bite of poisoned food became not only a physical act, but a spiritual message. The family that feasted on the suffering of others would finally taste death at the table. The doctors could not ignore the uncanny testimonies. Some survivors spoke of convulsions that seemed choreographed, bodies writhing in unnatural unison. One minister claimed he saw eyes roll back not in pain, but in possession, as though something had entered the bodies all at once. He preached that the devil had walked among them, using the cook as his vessel. For those who believed in demons and curses, the poisoning was not only a crime but a ritual. Yet to the emerging scientific minds of the time, such talk was intolerable. They preferred arsenic, glass, or even spoiled meat as explanations. The problem was certainty. Poison leaves traces, but in the 1800s those traces were hard to identify. Chemical tests were rudimentary, unreliable, and often tampered with by fear. To proclaim arsenic was to provide a neat story. To admit uncertainty was to allow superstition to thrive. Still, the contradictions persisted. Some bodies decomposed rapidly within hours, skin blistering and turning dark. Others remained eerily intact as though time hesitated. Folklore filled the gaps. Perhaps the cook had chosen victims differently, sparing some, damning others. Perhaps the poison carried choice, guided by unseen hands. Or perhaps the differences were merely biology, one person's body breaking faster than another's. Among the enslaved, there were stories of kitchen conjure, recipes that blended seasoning with spellcraft. Bay leaves could be prayers. Peppercorns could carry warnings. A root slipped into broth could tether a spirit. Did the cook draw from this hidden knowledge? Had she transformed the plantation kitchen, a place of servitude, into a site of judgment? For those who believed, the poisoning was not simply revenge but restoration of balance, a reckoning disguised as dinner. The surviving records reveal a clash of language. Physicians wrote of toxic ingestion and possible mineral substance. Ministers wrote of dark forces and witchcraft at work. Neighbors wrote of fear, claiming livestock died in the days after the feast, that milk soured before sunrise, that even the soil smelled of sulfur. One farmer swore he saw crows circling the plantation in numbers never before witnessed, their cries echoing like a chorus of lamentation. The natural and the supernatural tangled until no line remained clear. Psychologists today might call this mass hysteria, the mind's way of shaping chaos into story. Fear demands explanation, and in the absence of proof, people will weave myths. Yet myths once born rarely die. The story of the poisoned wedding feast spread through the region, each telling bending toward either logic or legend. For some, the cook was a murderer. For others, she was a vessel of cosmic justice. Consider the silence of the cook herself. Few words remain attributed to her, and even those are disputed. Some say she confessed, whispering that the family had stolen everything from her life and she wanted them to taste her sorrow. Others claim she never spoke, her eyes steady, lips closed, as if her silence itself was the final word. Silence, too, can be superstition, an emptiness that others rush to fill with their fears and imaginations. The courtroom that followed was a theater of contradictions. Lawyers cited medical texts alongside Bible verses. Witnesses contradicted one another. One described powders hidden in flour. Another insisted on a curse uttered at dawn. The judge demanded clarity but received only fog. In the end, the verdict was less about science or proof and more about belief. Belief in control, in hierarchy, in the need to assign blame. The cook became the embodiment of mystery, too dangerous to be left unexplained. Yet the questions endure. Could one woman truly have orchestrated such devastation with simple poison? If so, how did she gain the knowledge? And if not, why did so many believe in shadows and curses? Was the poisoning an act of calculated chemistry, or was it a ritual act rooted in traditions that the enslaved carried despite every attempt to erase them? Modern science might solve the puzzle with toxicology, but the past does not surrender so easily. We are left with fragments, inflamed stomachs, burned tissue, voices that claim to hear songs, and shadows that dim the candles. Each fragment demands interpretation, and interpretation, when history is clouded, becomes storytelling. Perhaps that is why this wedding feast still lingers in whispers. Because whether poison or curse, whether arsenic or ancestral wrath, the night revealed something undeniable. Science could not silence superstition, and superstition could not erase science. They fed each other, two forces circling the same mystery, neither able to consume it fully. And so the tale survives, not as fact, not as fiction, but as both. A poisoned feast, a cursed celebration, a collision of medicine and myth. The truth may have been buried with the victims, but the questions remain alive, echoing like footsteps in a darkened hall. The night that was meant to bind two families in joy became the night that tore them apart forever. History remembers the poisoned feast, but history rarely lingers on the voices of those who lived to tell of it. Their accounts, fragmented, contradictory, and often clouded by fear, form the trembling backbone of what little we know. For the dead leave silence, but the living leave stories, and those stories reveal how a community struggled to make sense of an atrocity that seemed both human and unearthly. One of the earliest testimonies came from a young bridesmaid, no older than 16, who swore she had seen the cook standing at the edge of the hall when chaos erupted. In her recollection, the bride was mid-laughter, lifting her glass for a toast when her face suddenly twisted in agony. Plates fell, glasses shattered, and a ripple of terror spread. Yet the bridesmaid's eyes were fixed not on the bride but on the cook. She claimed the woman was smiling, not a broad grin but a faint, knowing curve of the lips, as though watching a story finally reach its conclusion. Others dismissed her words as hysteria, the imaginings of a child scarred by trauma. But the image persisted, carved into rumor like an engraving on stone. The silent smile of a cook who may have witnessed her revenge unfold in real time. Another account came from a house servant, a man who had lived his entire life on the plantation. He claimed that the wine itself seemed alive, as though the liquid trembled before lips touched the rim. In his telling, he poured goblets that shimmered unnaturally in the candlelight, and when the guests drank, it was not long before the air was filled with choking gasps. He insisted that what he saw could not be explained by mere poison, that the feast had been imbued with a force that moved beyond nature. To his death, he swore that the wine moved on its own. Whether he meant the shimmer of liquid disturbed by trembling hands, or whether his mind grafted supernatural meaning onto the memory of horror, no one can say. But his words were repeated in hushed tones for years, a detail too uncanny to forget. Neighbors who lived beyond the plantation's borders added their own layer of dread. They claimed the curse did not stop at the wedding hall. Livestock sickened, crops withered, children woke screaming of shadows pressing on their chests. To them, the cook had not only destroyed a family, she had loosed something into the land itself, something that clung to the soil and the air. For decades, even after the plantation fell into ruin, locals avoided its grounds. Hunters said their dogs refused to cross the old fence line. Families warned their children that to eat food taken from the plantation's earth was to invite death. These stories painted the cook in starkly different hues. To some, she was a monster, a woman who weaponized the intimacy of food, twisting nourishment into murder. To others, she was a martyr, a soul who endured so much cruelty that vengeance became her only language. Each perspective reveals not just what people saw, but how they needed to believe. For in the aftermath of horror, belief is a shield, whether it be the belief in evil to explain cruelty, or the belief in justice to justify tragedy. Psychologists today might call this a trauma response, survivors forcing chaos into narrative order. For the bridesmaid, the image of the cook's faint smile gave her pain a villain, a focal point. For the servant, the trembling wine absolved him of guilt. He had poured the cups, yet if the wine itself was alive, then the blame did not rest on his hands. For the neighbors, curses explained why their crops failed and their livestock weakened. To accept random misfortune would be unbearable. To believe in a lingering curse gave meaning, however dark. But religion too had its hand in shaping memory. Local priests claimed the massacre bore the mark of the devil. They preached that the cook had been possessed, her act not one of human choice but of demonic influence. Sermons thundered with warnings. This was what happened when obedience was forsaken, when the natural order was disrupted. Others, however, whispered of older traditions, African roots carried across the ocean, herbs and chants meant to summon justice when human courts refused it. To them, the cook was not a vessel of the devil but a priestess, a bridge between suffering ancestors and the moment of reckoning. The tension between these interpretations never resolved. Survivors clung to their own truths, and the community fractured into camps. Some spoke only of poison, eager to ground the horror in tangible fact. Others insisted on shadows, curses, and unseen hands guiding the night. Over time, these divergent stories braided into folklore, each strand colored by fear, guilt, or the need for justice. One chilling testimony came decades later, when the bridesmaid, by then an old woman, retold her story to her grandchildren. She confessed that her memory had changed with age. Where once she swore she saw a smile, now she wondered if it had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flicker of candles. Yet she also admitted that whether smile or shadow, the image haunted her dreams. It was as though her mind refused to let the cook's presence fade, forever binding her to that night. Trauma does not always preserve fact. It preserves sensation, emotion, the visceral weight of terror. And sometimes that is stronger than truth. Even medical testimonies fueled the mystery. A physician who examined survivors noted that many complained of hearing songs in the food, faint hums as though voices echoed through the dishes before they ate. He dismissed it as mass hysteria, the product of fear and suggestibility. But his notes, preserved in archives, fed the myth. To the faithful, it proved that spirits had indeed been summoned. To the rationale, it revealed only the fragility of the human mind under duress. What makes these accounts so haunting is not just what they describe, but how they contradict each other. One claims a smile, another a curse, another a supernatural shimmer. Each account insists upon its own version of reality, yet none can be fully proven or dismissed. Together they form a kaleidoscope of horror, each shard reflecting a different angle of the same nightmarish event. And perhaps that is the essence of survivor memory. Fragmented, imperfect, but deeply human. The mind bends under the weight of trauma, reshaping reality until it fits within the boundaries of belief. Was the cook a smiling murderer or a vessel of ancestral justice? Did the wine move on its own, or did trembling hands create the illusion? Did the curse spread to the land, or did grief make misfortune contagious? As the years passed, the survivors' voices grew quieter, their memories fading into legend. Yet the questions they left behind never found resolution. Each story invites belief, and each belief reflects the fears and hopes of those who lived. Today, when we read their words, we are confronted with the same divide. Logic demands poison, psychology explains trauma, but folklore whispers of shadows and spirits. And in that clash lies the enduring mystery. Survivors gave us fragments, but perhaps fragments are all we are meant to have. For if the truth were ever fully known, it might lose its power to haunt. The plantation stands in ruins now, its once grand hall reduced to rubble and weeds. But travelers still claim to feel unease in the air, as though echoes of screams linger in the soil. Some say the cook's spirit walks the grounds, neither condemned nor absolved, forever caught between vengeance and justice. Others argue she was human, and like all humans, her story deserves neither demonization nor sainthood, but the acknowledgement of pain that led to choices unbearable to imagine. Yet one fact remains unshakable. Those who survived could never agree on what they saw. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the poisoned feast. Not certainty, but the persistence of doubt. A doubt that gnaws, that whispers, that ensures the story will never die. Even now, when the tale is told in hushed voices, listeners divide just as the survivors once did. Was it murder? Was it ritual? Was it curse? Or was it something else entirely? Something that defies explanation? The survivors may have lived through that night, but none ever escaped it. And in their fractured voices we hear not only a story of horror, but the deeper truth. That memory itself can be as haunting as any ghost. No one can say with certainty what became of the cook after the poisoned feast. Her presence at the center of the horror is undeniable, yet her fate dissolves into fog, swallowed by rumor, fragmentary records, and the storytelling instincts of generations desperate to explain her. Some claim she was seized that very night, dragged from the kitchen and bound in chains before a horrified crowd. Others whispered she slipped away into the swamps, vanishing into a labyrinth of reeds and shadows where no hound could track her. Still others insisted she never left at all, that her body was broken, but her spirit remained, restless and unrepentant, haunting every southern kitchen where pots bubbled and knives gleamed. Theories about her fate multiplied with time, each version reflecting not only fear of what she had done, but what she symbolized. One set of plantation records describes a hanging, carried out hastily at dawn with no trial, no sermon, only the crude closure of rope. According to these accounts, her body swayed for hours, left as a warning to others who might dare to turn sustenance into rebellion. Yet no grave marker exists, no official notice preserved. For some, this absence proves erasure, a deliberate attempt to bury the shame of being undone by one who was meant to serve. Other sources contradict this entirely. Local oral traditions, stories carried in whispers through generations of African American families, tell of her escape. They claim she fled through hidden routes known only to the enslaved, slipping into swamps where water and moss swallowed footsteps. There she was said to have lived as a fugitive, aided by marooned communities of runaways who built secret lives in places white eyes rarely saw. To these tellings, she did not die in chains but lived as a free woman, her vengeance accomplished, her story unbroken. Some even claim descendants walk among us still, carrying her bloodline in silence. But then there are the spectral versions, the myths woven not from history but from fear. Children were warned not to leave food unfinished, lest the cook return to punish waste. Women stirring pots late at night whispered of feeling watched, as if unseen hands stirred with them. Kitchen fires that flared unexpectedly were said to be her anger rising. Some even claimed her reflection appeared faintly in polished silver, lips curved in the same eerie smile survivors described. In these stories she became less a person and more a presence, an embodiment of vengeance that refused to rest. Psychology offers its own lens. Myths, after all, are born from the human need to shape chaos into meaning. For white plantation families, the cook became a specter of fear, the reminder that those forced to serve them could wield invisible power. Poison is intimate, unseen until it is too late. To imagine the cook surviving was to imagine rebellion always lurking in the shadows. For the enslaved, however, her myth carried a different weight. She became a symbol of resistance, a whispered reassurance that even within bondage there were ways to strike back. Her story, whether tragic or triumphant, belonged to the lineage of quiet defiance. Scholars who study folklore debate her legacy. Was she a monster, defined solely by an act of mass murder? Or was she a proto-feminist icon, a woman who rejected her assigned role of servitude and wielded the tools of her oppression, kitchen, herbs, fire, as instruments of justice? Historical context complicates the question. Records show that enslaved cooks often bore unique burdens, trusted with preparing food, yet constantly surveilled, accused of every illness, scapegoated for every mishap. In that precarious position, the kitchen became both prison and stage, a place where submission and resistance danced uneasily. Theories about the specific method of poisoning only deepen the divide between fact and myth. Some scientists argue she used arsenic, a common poison in that era, easily obtained through rat poison. Others believe in herbal concoctions, roots drawn from African traditions that blurred the line between medicine and curse. A few even suggest ground glass, hidden in cakes that sparkled deceptively in candlelight. Each theory reflects the storyteller's frame. Science insists on the clinical, folklore insists on the uncanny. Religion shaped the myth further. Ministers thundered from pulpits that she was a servant of Satan, her act proof that evil walked in human form. They warned congregations that rebellion against God-ordained hierarchy would always end in blood. But within hush harbors, where enslaved people worshipped away from white eyes, different interpretations thrived. There she was sometimes spoken of as chosen by ancestors, a vessel through whom long-denied justice was finally delivered. In her story, faith and folklore merged, each shaping her into either devil or prophet. As decades passed, the cook's tale stretched beyond its origin. Folklorists recorded versions where she was less a person than a cautionary phantom. In one account, she wanders kitchens at midnight, trailing the scent of burnt sugar. In another, she appears at weddings, face half hidden, a silent guest at the edge of joy. Supernatural or not, these myths reveal how deeply her story embedded itself in the cultural imagination. She became part of the South's haunted landscape, her presence lingering in kitchens, fields, and nightmares. Yet myths evolve not just through fear but through need. In the 20th century, as scholars began reframing slavery's history, some writers elevated her into a symbol of female resistance. Plays and poems reimagined her not as a monster, but as an avenger, a woman denied agency who seized control in the only way available to her. Others pushed back, warning that romanticizing her act glossed over the horror of mass death. The debate sharpened. Was she a villain who poisoned innocents or a victim whose rage exposed the cruelty of bondage? The lack of definitive records allows all theories to coexist. Did she die at the rope? Did she vanish into swamps? Did she linger as spirit? The uncertainty fuels fascination. Each generation reinterprets her, layering new meaning atop old fragments. Children of the South still hear whispers about her, not in textbooks but in kitchens and porches, where elders pass warnings wrapped in story. Don't mock your food, some say, or the cook will come for you. In that warning, discipline and folklore converge, preserving memory through fear. What endures most is the shadow she casts. In truth, whether she died, escaped, or became myth, her legacy outlived the plantation. She reminds us of how fragile joy can be, how easily a wedding feast can become a funeral, how thin the line is between nourishment and destruction. In her innocence and evil blur, fact and fiction merge, psychology and religion clash. She is not only the cook who poisoned a family, she is the possibility that rebellion, justice, and terror can all share the same face. And so her story closes not with clarity but with questions. Was she monster, martyr, or myth? Did she act from cold calculation? Or was she driven by spirits older than the land itself? Was her smile the satisfaction of vengeance, or the mask of a woman who had already crossed into legend? Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing one version, but in accepting that all are true in their own way. For history provides fragments, folklore provides meaning, and myth provides endurance. Together they weave a tapestry where fact and fiction cannot be untangled. And within that tapestry, the cook remains, forever elusive, forever debated, forever haunting. Even now, when the story is told in hushed voices, the questions resurface. Did she hang? Did she vanish? Does she still walk the earth? Theories abound, but certainty eludes. What endures is the shadow, stretching across centuries, binding joy to terror, nourishment to death, truth to myth. And perhaps that shadow is the truest legacy of all. The farmhouse where the massacre once unfolded now lies in silence, its brickwork crumbling under creeping ivy, its kitchen reduced to dust and echoes. Yet locals still claim that on certain nights, when the wind drifts through broken windows, you can hear faint humming, a lullaby said to belong to the cook-slave, the woman who once stirred pots that carried death instead of life. Some dismiss it as imagination, others swear it is real. The question has lingered for centuries. Was she victim or villain? A woman who sought justice with the only weapons available to her? Or a murderer whose fury consumed both guilty and innocent alike? History does not grant us clarity. Fragments of her existence remain, snippets of testimony, faded church records, whispered recollections passed down like ghost stories. Psychology would reduce her actions to trauma, a lifetime of oppression boiling over in one decisive act. Folklore, however, elevates her into something more than human, a spirit of vengeance, a conjurer whose knowledge of roots and herbs bound her story to the supernatural. These two lenses, rational explanation and mystical dread, have forever battled to define her legacy. Some insist she was captured and executed swiftly, hanged beneath the oak where slaves once gathered in chains. Others argue she slipped into the swamps, vanishing into the labyrinth of reeds and shadows, where whispers say she lived out her days among fugitives. Still others claim she never died at all, that she became part of the land, a restless presence tied to kitchens, hearths, and the act of preparing food itself. Parents frighten disobedient children with her name, warning them not to waste bread or disrespect meals, lest the cook return in the night with her poisoned feast. Even the supposed victims are cloaked in contradiction. Some medical reports suggest arsenic or powdered glass. Others describe symptoms that no ordinary toxin could explain. Convulsions, visions, the sensation of being watched. Survivors claimed the wine shimmered unnaturally, that shadows passed across the hall before the first body fell. Were these the imaginings of terror, or glimpses of something truly unearthly? The story refuses resolution. It sits between the lines of history, where fact blurs into myth and justice merges with horror. What makes it endure is not certainty but ambiguity. For in that ambiguity lies power. The power to unsettle, to disturb, to keep audiences leaning closer to the flame of the tale. Was she a woman crushed by a brutal system who chose her moment of rebellion on the night of a wedding? Or was she something darker, channeling forces that predated the plantation itself, forces that demanded blood in exchange for silence? The ruins offer no answers. The silence of the past does not speak. All that remains is a haunting question, echoing through time. Was this sweet, macabre revenge merely the act of a mortal hand? Or was it the work of something far beyond us,